The letter had been sitting on the mantel for 3 days, and Elinor Hartley still could not bring herself to touch it. It bore a wax seal she did not recognize, pressed into deep crimson, and inside its neat, unfamiliar hand was a sentence that had rearranged the whole shape of her future. She was to be married, within the season, to a man she had never once laid eyes upon. Lord Ashworth. A name spoken in Hartfield village, the way one might speak of weather too far off to prepare for. Vast, distant, and vaguely frightening. He was said to be cold, exacting, a man who had buried a fiancée's affection along with whatever tenderness he might once have possessed, and who now moved through the world collecting titles and land the way other men collected debts. And debts, in fact, were precisely why Elinor's uncle had arranged this. Her father had died owing more than the family name could bear, and Reginald Hartley, her uncle, her guardian, her only remaining authority, had found in Lord Ashworth's willingness to settle those debts, in exchange for a bride, a solution too convenient to refuse. Elinor had not been asked. She had been informed. She stood now at the narrow window of the parlour, watching rain begin to needle the glass, and felt something close to dread settle low in her chest. Somewhere beyond the hills, in a house grander than she could imagine, a stranger was waiting to become her husband. And she did not know the first true thing about him. She did not yet know that the truth would arrive, soaked and shivering, at her very door before the week was through, nor that when it did, she would not recognize it at all. The storm broke fully by nightfall, hurling itself against Hartfield Cottage with a violence that rattled the shutters and put out 2 of the parlour candles before Elinor could catch them. Her Aunt Constance had retired early with a headache, and so it was Elinor alone who heard the pounding at the door beneath the roar of the wind, 3 sharp knocks, then a long pause, then one more, weaker. She opened it to find a man collapsed nearly against the frame, drenched to the bone, his greatcoat plastered black with rain, and mud streaked up one side of his face as though he had fallen from his horse and dragged himself the rest of the way. "Forgive me," he managed, his voice rough with cold. "My horse threw me on the north road. I saw your light." For one suspended moment Elinor only stared at him, at the dark hair stuck flat to his forehead, at eyes the colour of storm glass, pale and startling even in his exhaustion, at the sheer helplessness of a man who, whatever he was clearly in no state to be turned away. Every instinct of caution her aunt had ever instilled in her told her to hesitate. A strange man, alone at night, with no chaperone in the house but a sleeping aunt upstairs. It was precisely the sort of situation ruin was made of. But there was something in the shape of his exhaustion, something almost apologetic in the way he swayed on his feet even as he tried to stand straight for her benefit, that undid her hesitation entirely. "Come in before you catch your death," she said, and stepped back to let him pass. He did not give his name at first, and she did not ask for it, there seemed, in that moment. Something almost impolite in demanding identification from a man who could barely stand. She sat him near the hearth, built the fire higher, and fetched a blanket from the linen press, though it was, admittedly, one meant for a bed rather than a gentleman's shoulders. He accepted it without complaint, wrapping it around himself with the faint, wry embarrassment of a man unused to being tended. "You needn't trouble yourself," he said, teeth still chattering slightly. "I've imposed enough for one evening." "You've imposed exactly as much as a man thrown from his horse in a storm ought to impose," Elinor said, setting a kettle over the fire. "Which is to say, not nearly enough to earn my regret in the morning." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, she thought, though it passed quickly, replaced by a careful, watching stillness. He studied her in a way that made her feel, absurdly, as though she were being read like a page of small print. "You're very calm," he observed, "for a woman who's just let a stranger into her home at midnight." "I've had a great deal of practice being calm about things I cannot change," Elinor said, before she could soften it, and then wished she hadn't said quite so much to a man whose name she did not even know. He did not press her on it. He only watched the fire for a long moment, as though turning her words over, weighing them for something she hadn't intended to give him. "Might I ask your name?" he said finally, "since you've been kind enough not to ask for mine?" "Elinor," she said. "Elinor Hartley." If the name meant anything to him, he gave no sign of it, no flicker, no pause, nothing at all beyond a small, courteous incline of the head. "Then I am in your debt, Miss Hartley. Twice over, it seems, for the fire and for the mercy of your discretion. You still haven't given me your name," she pointed out, pouring tea with hands that had, she noticed distantly, stopped trembling from the cold of opening the door and begun trembling for some other reason entirely. He hesitated, the smallest fraction of a heartbeat, so brief she nearly missed it, though she would remember it later, turn it over in her mind 100 times, once she understood what it had cost him to answer at all. "Ash," he said. "You may call me Ash." It was not, strictly, a lie. It was simply not the whole of the truth, and he told himself, watching her hand steady over the teapot, that there would be time enough later to give her the rest of it. He had not planned to stop at any cottage along the North Road. He had not planned, in truth, to arrive at his own betrothal in any manner but the correct one, announced, expected, armoured in his title the way he armoured himself in most rooms he entered. But the storm had made a fool of his plans, and the fall from his horse had bruised more than his pride, and now he sat wrapped in a stranger's blanket, watching a woman who did not know she was looking at the very man she dreaded marrying. He told himself he would correct the misunderstanding before the night was through. He did not. "You're a groom, then," Elinor said, handing him the tea, glancing at the plain cut of his coat beneath the mud, at hands that, though elegant enough, bore none of the soft uselessness she'd always imagined belonged to gentlemen of consequence. "For some house nearby? I don't recognize you from the village." "Something of that sort," Ashy said, which was, again, not precisely a lie, though it curved rather generously around the truth. He was, after all, master of every stable within 20 miles in every direction. Did that not make him, in some sense, a groom to all of them? Elinor accepted this with the easy curiosity of someone who had larger troubles of her own to occupy her, and something in him, something long dormant, long guarded, eased at the lack of scrutiny. No one, in longer than he cared to admit, had spoken to him without some awareness pressing at the edges of the conversation, his title, his fortune, the weight of what he could offer or withhold. This woman spoke to him as though he was simply a cold, tired man who required tea and a fire, and nothing more complicated than that. "You said you had practice being calm about things you cannot change," he said, when the silence had stretched comfortably enough to bear examining. That sounded like a sentence with a story behind it. Elinor's mouth curved, though without much humour in it. "It has several. Actually, my father died in debt 8 months ago. My uncle has arranged a marriage to settle what remains of it. I am to meet my betrothed within the fortnight, and I am told he is cold, proud, and entirely uninterested in my opinion on the matter." She said it lightly, the way one learns to say unbearable things aloud so they cannot ambush you later. "So you see, Mr. Ash, I have had rather a great deal of practice." Ash went very still. He knew, of course, precisely which marriage she meant. He had read the arrangement in his solicitor's careful script only a fortnight past. A Hartley girl, of good but diminished family, whose uncle was eager to trade her hand for the settling of considerable debt. He had not asked for details of her character. He had not asked, in truth, whether she wished for the match at all. It had not occurred to him that a woman in her circumstance would have any opinion worth soliciting, and he was, uncomfortably, beginning to understand what an error that had been. "And this betrothed of yours," he said carefully, watching her over the rim of his cup, "what do you imagine him to be? beyond cold and proud. I imagine, Elinor said, that he has never once had to sit with a stranger by firelight and wonder whether he'll be able to pay for coal come winter. I imagine he has never had to smile at people he despises, because his family's comfort depended on it. I imagine, in short, that he has been given every advantage a person can be given, and has used none of them to become someone worth marrying for anything but his money. She caught herself, flushed faintly. Forgive me. That was uncharitable, and I don't even know the man. No, Ashley said slowly. You don't. He should have told her then. The words gathered at the back of his throat, and he opened his mouth to say them. I am the man you speak of, Miss Hartley, and I would very much like to prove your imagination wrong. But something in her face stopped him. She looked, in that moment, entirely unguarded, entirely herself. In a way he understood instinctively she would never again be once she knew who he was. Every woman he had met since inheriting his title had performed some version of herself for his benefit. Brighter, softer, more agreeable than she truly was, angling always toward his approval. He found, sitting across from Elinor Hartley in her modest parlor with mud drying on his boots, that he was not yet ready to lose this particular unguarded version of her to the machinery of rank. Tell me, he said instead, what you would wish for, if the choice were entirely yours. Elinor considered this with a seriousness that surprised him. Not the reflexive answer of a woman flattering a stranger, but genuine thought, as though the question itself were a small gift she hadn't expected to be offered. I should like to be chosen, she said finally, rather than assigned. I should like a husband who wanted me for something more particular than the convenience of my existence. I know that is not how the world generally arranges these matters, but I find I cannot quite give up wanting it regardless. She glanced at him, embarrassed suddenly by her own honesty. You must think me foolish. I think, Ashley said, and meant it more completely than he had meant anything in some years, that you are the least foolish person I have spoken with in a very long while. The fire burned low as the storm raged on outside, and something unspoken settled between them. Not quite understanding, not yet trust, but the fragile beginning of both. Elinor found herself, against every instinct of caution, telling him things she had not told even her aunt, of the loneliness of watching her father's health fail alongside his fortune, of the particular humiliation of being discussed in her own uncle's parlor, as though she were an asset to be liquidated, rather than a woman with a heart that still, foolishly, hoped for something gentler than mere survival. As she listened, he asked questions that showed he had truly heard her, not merely waited his turn to speak. And when, near 2 in the morning, exhaustion finally overtook them both, he found himself more reluctant to end the conversation than he had been to end anything in longer than he could easily remember. You should sleep, Elinor said at last, rising to fetch a second blanket. The settee isn't much, but it's dry, at least, which is more than can be said for the road. It will do admirably, he said, and meant it, though he had slept in beds that could have swallowed the entire cottage twice over. Miss Hartley, Elinor, if I may. Thank you. For the fire. The tea. He paused, searching for the word, and found to his mild surprise that the truest one was simply the kindness of not asking more of me than I could give tonight. You're a stranger thrown from his horse in a storm, Elinor said, softening despite herself. I should hope kindness requires no explanation beyond that. He watched her retreat toward the stairs, candle in hand, and felt something he had not permitted himself to feel in years press uncomfortably against his ribs, something that felt dangerously close to hope, and equally close to guilt. For the lie he had allowed to stand between them, small as it seemed, and for how much larger it would grow before morning came. He was gone before first light. Elinor woke to find the blanket folded with unnecessary precision at the end of the settee, the fire banked with a care that suggested he had lingered a while before leaving, and, on the small table beside it, a single item that made her breath catch, a signet ring, heavy gold, engraved with a crest she did not recognize, resting atop a folded note in a hand she now knew. "I did not wish to leave without some token of gratitude," the note read, "though I fear this is a poor substitute for the debt I truly owe you. Keep it, if you will allow me the vanity of hoping you might think of me now and again. I do not think I shall easily forget you, Miss Hartley." As she turned the ring over in her fingers, tracing the unfamiliar crest, and felt something warm and reckless bloom in her chest that she did not yet have a name for, though she suspected, uneasily, that she would recognize it soon enough for exactly what it was. She did not know, holding that ring in the grey light of a rain-washed morning, that she was holding the very crest of the house she was promised to marry into, that the man who had called himself merely Ash was, in the ledgers and letters and whispered village gossip alike, Alexander Vane, 7th Earl of Ashworth, master of an estate so vast it touched 3 counties, a man rumoured to own, in land, in shipping interests, in the quiet accumulation of a fortune too enormous to be spoken of without a certain hush, very nearly half of England. She only knew that a soaked stranger had sat across from her by firelight, listened as though her words mattered, and left behind a ring she could not stop turning over in her hands, wondering, with a foolish, unguarded hope she had thought debt and grief had long since burned out of her, whether she might ever see him again. She would. Sooner, and far more disastrously than she imagined. The summons to Ashworth Hall arrived 4 days later, carried by a liveried footman whose crisp formality only sharpened Elinor's dread. She was to present herself within the week, to be formally introduced to her betrothed, Lord Ashworth, prior to the reading of the marriage settlement. Her uncle, delighted beyond his usual sourness, spoke of the visit as though it were a triumph rather than a sentence being carried out. "You'll want your good blue gown," Aunt Constance fretted, laying garments across the bed with the anxious energy of a woman who understood precisely how much rode upon this meeting going well. "And do try, Elinor, to appear amiable. Lord Ashworth is not a man accustomed to being kept waiting, nor, I imagine, to being disagreed with." "I have heard as much," Elinor murmured, and thought, with a private, unexpected ache, of grey eyes by firelight, and a voice that had asked, gently, what she would wish for, if the choice were entirely her own. She had told no one of the stranger. Some instinct had kept the encounter close, private, a small, warm secret she was not yet ready to surrender to her aunt's inevitable scandalized commentary. She wore his ring now, on a ribbon beneath her collar, hidden against her skin, and told herself it meant nothing beyond sentiment for a kindness offered in a storm. The carriage ride to Ashworth Hall took the better part of a day, winding through country that grew steadily grander with every mile, parklands stretching to the horizon, tenant cottages neat and well kept, an avenue of ancient oaks that gave way, at last, to a house so vast that Elinor's first sight of it stole the breath entirely from her lungs. "Good heavens," she whispered, and her uncle, seated across from her, allowed himself a rare smile of satisfaction. "Good heavens indeed," he said. "You will conduct yourself, Elinor, in a manner befitting the extraordinary good fortune of this match. I trust I need not remind you what depends upon it." She did not answer. She was too occupied with the sinking, unaccountable feeling that had begun somewhere in her chest, and was spreading, cold and certain, through the whole of her body, a feeling she could not yet name, though every step closer to the great door of Ashworth Hall made it grow sharper. They were received in a hall of soaring proportions, marble underfoot, portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilded frames, and Elinor found herself gripping her uncle's arm rather more tightly than dignity strictly permitted as they were led toward the drawing-room where, she understood, her betrothed awaited. The doors opened, and there, standing by the window with his back half turned, dressed now in the unmistakable elegance of a man who owned every stitch upon his own body and half the land beneath his feet, was Ash. For one endless suspended moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned fully, and Elinor watched the last 4 days rearrange themselves entirely. The soaked stranger, the borrowed blanket, the tea poured with trembling hands, the ring she wore hidden beneath her collar, all of it collapsing into a single devastating understanding. "You," she said, and the word came out smaller than she intended, though it carried, unmistakably, the full weight of betrayal. "Elinor," Lord Ashworth said, and had the grace, at least, to look as though the ground had shifted beneath him too. "I can explain. You let me believe you were a groom," she said, and felt heat rise to her face, not merely embarrassment, but something sharper, something that cut. "You sat in my parlour and let me speak to you of my own betrothal, of my own opinion of you, while you already knew precisely who you were." "I did not plan it," he said, low, urgent, aware suddenly of her uncle's sharp attention and the footman still hovering near the door. "My horse threw me on the very road that led to your cottage. I meant to correct the misunderstanding within the hour. And then you found it more amusing to let me continue," Elinor said, and the tremor in her voice was not entirely anger, though anger was easier, in that moment, to hold on to than the alternative, the humiliating, undeniable ache of having been, however unwittingly, made a fool of. "That is not what happened," Ashworth said, and something in his voice, a rawness she recognized from the firelit hours of that stormy night, made her pause despite herself. "I found, for the first time in longer than I can say, a woman who spoke to me without calculation, without performance. I was not amused, Miss Hartley. I was," he stopped, aware of the room, of the audience, of everything that made the true sentence impossible to finish here. "I was moved," he said instead, quietly, "more than I anticipated. More, I think, than I was prepared for." Reginald Hartley, sensing the delicate architecture of a fortunate marriage teetering, stepped smoothly into the silence. "My lord, I'm certain my niece meant no offence. She is merely overcome. The honour of the match, you understand. The honour," Elinor repeated, and something in her, the private dignity she had guarded through 8 months of grief and diminishment, rose up sharp and clear. "Forgive me, my lord, but I do not believe I require my uncle to explain my feelings on my behalf. I was deceived. Whatever your reasons, however gently you dress them, I sat in my own home and told a stranger things I have told no one else, believing him to be exactly what he appeared, and he was not." "No," Ashworth agreed, and to his credit he did not flinch from it. "You are entirely right to be angry. I ask only that you allow me the chance, in time, to earn back whatever trust I forfeited by my silence." "Time," Elinor said, "is not something I have been permitted much say over, my lord. I am to marry you regardless of what I feel. Am I not? My uncle has already spent the settlement in his imagination a dozen times over." The words landed harder than she intended, and she watched something flicker across Ashworth's face. Not offence, but a kind of grim recognition, as though she had named precisely the wound he had spent years guarding against. "You are not wrong that the arrangement was made without your consent," he said, low enough that only she and her uncle could hear it clearly. "That is a fault of the world we were both born into, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I give you my word, Miss Hartley, whatever else you believe of me after tonight, this marriage will not proceed unless you wish it. I would rather forfeit every advantage this arrangement offers me than compel a woman to my house against her heart." Reginald Hartley made a strangled sound of protest, quickly swallowed under Ashworth's cool glance. "I mean it, sir," the Earl said. "The debt will be settled regardless of what your niece decides. That was never meant to be her price to pay." It was, Elinor would later admit to herself, the single sentence that undid the whole edifice of her anger, not because it excused the deception, but because it revealed something beneath it she had not expected, a man willing to surrender the very advantage that had brought her into his house at all, simply to give her back the choice that had been taken from her twice over, first by circumstance, and then, however unintentionally, by him. She said nothing further that evening. She was given a room to rest in, grand beyond anything she had known, and lay awake long into the night, turning the ring on its ribbon between her fingers, feeling the crest press cool against her skin, and wondering how a man could feel, in the space of one storm-lit night, both entirely a stranger and entirely known. The days that followed at Ashworth Hall unsettled Elinor in ways she had not anticipated. She had expected, upon learning the truth of Ashie's identity, to feel only anger, and for the first day that was, indeed, the whole of it, a hard, bright fury that kept her from the drawing-room, from the gardens, from anywhere she might encounter the Earl, and be obliged to speak civilly to him. But anger, she was discovering, was a poor companion for solitude, and by the second day it had begun to fray at the edges, revealing beneath it something far more complicated. She found him, on the third morning in the estate's small chapel, not at prayer precisely, but seated in the front pew, with his head bowed, a posture of such private weariness that she nearly withdrew before he noticed her. "Miss Hartley." He rose at once, formal again, though something in his eyes suggested the formality cost him more than it once might have. "I did not mean to intrude upon your solitude." "You didn't," she said. "I intruded upon yours. Forgive me, I'll go." "Please don't." The words came quickly, almost involuntarily, and he seemed faintly surprised by his own urgency. "I have wanted to speak with you properly since that first evening at your cottage, without an audience, without my rank standing between us like a wall neither of us can see past. If you would permit it." Elinor hesitated at the door, some part of her still guarding the wound of his deception, and yet another part, the part that had sat across from him by firelight and felt, for the first time in 8 months, genuinely heard, drew her forward despite herself. She sat, at last, at the far end of the pew, leaving a careful distance between them. "Why did you never marry?" she asked, before she could think better of the bluntness of it. "You are, forgive me, not a young man any more, and yet the village speaks of you as though marriage were a subject you avoid entirely." Something closed briefly over his face before he answered, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its usual careful control. "I was engaged once, some years ago. Her name was Lady Caroline Ives, and I believed, with the whole foolish certainty of a young man newly come into his title, that she loved me for myself." He paused. "I discovered, 3 weeks before our wedding, that she had accepted a far more advantageous offer from a viscount with a larger estate and a smaller conscience about announcing it publicly before informing me privately. I learned of my own broken engagement from a society column before I learned it from her." "I'm sorry," Elinor said, and meant it, feeling something in her anger toward him soften, despite her best efforts to hold it steady. "I tell you this not for your sympathy," Ashworth said, "but so you might understand why I did what I did at your cottage. When I realized who you were meant to be to me, some instinct, perhaps not a noble one, but an honest one, made me want to know you as a man before you knew me as a title. I have spent 9 years since Caroline assuming every woman who smiled at me was calculating the value of my name. I did not expect, that night, to find a woman who spoke to me as though I was simply cold and tired and in need of tea. I did not want to lose that too quickly to the machinery of who I am. "You might have simply told me the truth," Elinor said, though more gently now. "I would not have thought less of you for honesty, my lord. I think rather less of you for the lack of it." "I know," he said, "and I am sorrier for that than I have adequately said. But I ask you to believe this much at least. Everything I felt sitting across from you that night was real. The deception was in what I withheld, not in what I gave." Elinor studied him for a long moment, the Earl who had once been merely Ash, stripped now of the anonymity that had made honesty easy, and now burdened with all the weight of rank that made it so much harder, and felt the last hard edge of her anger begin, reluctantly, to dissolve into something far more dangerous: understanding. "I do not forgive you entirely," she said. "Not yet. But I no longer wish to avoid you, which I suppose is its own small mercy." "It is more mercy than I had any right to expect," Ashworth said, and the smile that touched his mouth, small, unguarded, entirely unlike the cold reputation the village had built around him, undid something in her chest she had thought carefully sealed away. It was in the weeks that followed that the true danger of the situation revealed itself, not in any single dramatic confrontation, but in the slow, cumulative weight of proximity. Elinor remained at Ashworth Hall at her aunt's insistence, ostensibly to allow the settlement negotiations time to conclude properly, and in that time she and the Earl fell, almost without either of them naming it, into a companionship that neither anger nor formality could adequately suppress. He showed her the library first, a room so vast it took her breath entirely, shelves rising 3 stories with a spiral stair connecting them, and he watched her wander it with an expression she did not yet understand was, simply, tenderness. "You may borrow whatever you like," he said. "I confess I have read perhaps a third of what's here. My father was a more devoted scholar than I have managed to be." "A third of this," Elinor said, gesturing at the endless shelves, "is more than most men read in a lifetime, my lord." "Alexander," he said quietly, "if we are to know each other honestly, I would rather you use my name than my title. I have had a great deal of the latter and rather too little of the former, from anyone who was not seeking something from me in return." She did not use it that day. The intimacy of it felt too large, too soon, but she found herself, over the following weeks, testing the shape of it privately, in her own mind, long before she ever spoke it aloud to him. They walked the orangery together, where he named plants his mother had once tended with a wistfulness that told Elinor, without his needing to say so directly, how much grief still lived in that particular grief. They rode together through the estate's parkland, where she discovered he was, in fact, an excellent horseman, despite the unfortunate exception that had first brought him to her door, and where he discovered, with visible delight, that she rode nearly as well as he did, having learned from her father before the family's fortunes fell. "You are not at all what the village believes you to be," he observed one afternoon, watching her laugh, genuinely, unguardedly, at some small absurdity of the estate's aging groundskeeper. "They speak of Miss Hartley as a poor relation, quiet and unremarkable. I find I cannot reconcile their description with the woman in front of me. And you," Elinor said, "are not at all what the village believes of you, either. They call you cold. Proud. I have not yet found either of those things in you, my lord, though I confess I have looked rather carefully." "Alexander," he corrected, softly, and this time, for the first time, she let herself say it. "Alexander," she said, and watched something in his face open, unguarded and entirely undefended, in a way she suspected very few people in his life had ever been permitted to witness. It was, perhaps, inevitable that such careful, growing tenderness would draw the attention of those who found it inconvenient. Lady Vivienne Croft, a distant cousin of the Ashworth family, and a woman who had, for some years, nurtured private hopes of securing the Earl's hand for herself, arrived at the hall under the thin pretense of a family visit within the month. and made her displeasure at the situation clear within her first evening. "How charming," she said to Elinor over dinner, her smile sharp beneath its politeness, "that Lord Ashworth has taken such a personal interest in settling his obligations. I had not realized debt collection required quite so much private attention." "Vivienne," Ashworth said, a warning edge beneath his even tone. "I only mean," Vivienne continued, undeterred, "that it is rather unusual, is it not, for a man of your position to spend so many afternoons walking the grounds with a woman whose family required rescuing from ruin. One does wonder what conclusions might be drawn by those less charitable than myself." Elinor felt heat rise to her face, the old familiar shame of being discussed as a liability rather than a person, but found, to her own surprise, that she no longer felt entirely alone in the room to bear it. "The conclusion to be drawn, Lady Vivienne," Ashworth said, with a coldness Elinor had genuinely never yet witnessed from him, "is that I have found, in Miss Hartley's company, more genuine conversation in a single afternoon than I have found in this house in some years. If that troubles you, I confess I find myself entirely unmoved by the trouble." Vivienne's composure faltered, briefly, before she recovered it with practiced smoothness. "Of course, my lord. Forgive my impertinence." But her gaze, when it settled on Elinor afterward, carried a promise that this would not be the end of the matter, and Elinor understood, with a sinking clarity, that whatever peace had been growing between herself and Alexander was about to be tested by forces neither of them fully controlled. The test came sooner than either expected, and in a form crueler than open confrontation. Lady Vivienne, having failed to dislodge Elinor through direct insult, turned to subtler methods. Within a fortnight, whispers had begun circulating through the hall's staff, and more dangerously, through the wider society that occasionally called upon Ashworth, whispers suggesting that Elinor Hartley had arranged the entire Storm Night encounter deliberately, having somehow learned in advance of the Earl's travel plans, in order to secure his sympathy and affection before the formal betrothal could sour his opinion of a match he had entered only for the settling of debt. It was a lie constructed with cruel precision, for it took the very tenderness that had grown between them and twisted it into calculation, transforming Elinor, in the eyes of those inclined to believe the worst, from an innocent woman caught in circumstance into a scheming opportunist who had orchestrated her own rescue. Elinor heard the rumor first from her aunt, who arrived at the hall in a state of considerable distress, clutching a letter from a mutual acquaintance in the village. "They are saying you planned it," Constance said, wringing her hands. "That you knew his travel route, that you arranged to be alone that night specifically to entrap him before he could see you properly assessed alongside more suitable candidates." "Elinor, if this reaches Lord Ashworth's ear in the wrong company, if he begins to doubt, he will not believe it," Elinor said, though even as she spoke the words, a cold uncertainty crept through her. She had known Alexander now for little more than a month. Was that truly enough to trust that he would not, in a weak or wounded moment, wonder whether the woman who had welcomed a soaked stranger into her home that night had known all along precisely whom she was welcoming? She did not have to wonder long. Alexander found her that same evening in the library, his expression tight with a tension she had not yet seen from him, and her stomach dropped before he had spoken a single word. "Elinor," he said, "I must ask you something, and I ask you to understand that I do not ask lightly, nor because I wish to believe the answer will be anything but what I already hope it is." "You've heard the rumor," she said. "I have heard it from 3 separate sources today alone," he admitted, "that you knew somehow of my travel that night, that the storm, the fall, all of it, that you had arranged circumstances to secure my sympathy before I could see you fairly measured against other prospects." He paused, and something in his face, some flicker of doubt he could not quite suppress despite his evident effort to, cut Elinor more deeply than any open accusation could have. "You believe it," she said, quietly, and felt something in her chest crack open. Not merely hurt, but a deeper, more devastating grief. The particular grief of discovering that even tenderness this genuine could still be undermined by the same suspicion that had colored every interaction of her life since her father's debts had made her. In the eyes of the world, a woman whose motives could never again be assumed pure. "I do not believe it," Alexander said. Quickly, urgently, "I am asking you to help me understand how to answer those who repeat it. Because I find I cannot simply dismiss malicious gossip, with nothing but my own conviction to stand against it, not when it concerns your reputation as much as mine. And is that not, in itself, a kind of belief?" Elinor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "That you require reassurance at all? I told you everything that night by the fire, because I believed, foolishly, that I was speaking to a stranger with nothing to gain from my words. I did not know your name, Alexander. I did not know your house, your fortune, your rank. I knew only a cold, tired man who asked me what I wished for, and I answered him honestly because I believed, for the first time in longer than I can say, that my answer mattered to no one's advantage but perhaps, in some small way, my own comfort in the telling of it." Her voice caught, and she pressed on before it could fail her entirely. "If you require proof that my heart was honest that night, then I fear I have none to offer beyond the very honesty itself, which you now tell me is precisely what stands accused." She left him standing amid the towering shelves of his father's library, and did not look back to see whether her words had struck as deeply as she intended, though she suspected, from the silence that followed her out, that they had. Elinor withdrew from the hall's company entirely for the better part of a week, taking her meals in her room, walking the gardens only at hours she judged least likely to encounter anyone, least of all Alexander. The wound was not merely in the rumor itself, cruel as it was, but in the moment of doubt she had glimpsed in his face, proof, however brief, that even the deepest tenderness could be shaken by suspicion when the world pressed hard enough against it. She began, in that solitary week, to consider seriously what she had not permitted herself to consider before, leaving Ashworth Hall entirely, returning to Hartfield Cottage, and informing her uncle that whatever settlement had been promised, she could not proceed with a marriage built upon ground so easily undermined by gossip and doubt. It was her aunt, of all people, who finally drew the truth of her intentions from her. "You mean to refuse him," Constance said, over a tea neither of them had touched, on the 6th day of Elinor's self-imposed isolation. "I mean to refuse a marriage in which my own honesty can be called into question by a woman with nothing better to occupy her spite," Elinor said. "I told you, aunt, from the very beginning of this arrangement, that I wished to be chosen, not assigned. If Lord Ashworth cannot stand entirely certain of me against a rumor, with no evidence beyond malice to support it, then I fear he has not chosen me at all. He has merely inherited me, the way he inherits every other obligation attached to his name." "And what of the debt?" Constance asked, gently. "Your uncle—" "My uncle's debts are not my inheritance to bear at the cost of my dignity," Elinor said, with a firmness that surprised even herself. Lord Ashworth himself said as much that first evening at the Hall. "The settlement," he told my uncle plainly, "would not depend upon my consent to the marriage. If that promise held any truth at all, then I am free to walk away from this, whatever it costs me in comfort, and retain at least the one thing that has been mine to keep, through every other loss this year, has brought me." She wrote her letter of withdrawal that same evening, a careful, dignified explanation addressed to Alexander, thanking him for his honesty in the library regarding his past, acknowledging the genuine tenderness that had grown between them, but stating plainly that she could not enter a marriage shadowed, even briefly, by the doubt she had witnessed in his eyes. She intended to deliver it in the morning and depart for Hartfield Cottage before the week's end. She did not know, sealing that letter by candlelight, that Alexander had spent the same week in a private torment of his own, that the flicker of doubt she had glimpsed had not been doubt of her honesty at all, but a far older, more corrosive fear. The fear that he was, once again, about to lose someone whose regard he had come to need more than he had permitted himself to admit, and that his own damaged instincts, forged in the wreckage of Caroline's betrayal, had nearly cost him the one woman who had never once calculated her affection for his advantage. He came to her door before her letter could be delivered, and what passed between them that morning would determine at last whether the fragile thing growing between a soaked stranger and a woman who had sheltered him from the storm could survive the weight of the world pressing in around it. Elinor was startled from her packing by a sharp knock, and opened her door to find Alexander standing in the corridor, still in his riding clothes, as though he had come directly from the stables, without pausing to consider his appearance, an uncharacteristic disorder that told her, before he spoke a single word, how thoroughly the week had unsettled him too. "I have found her," he said, without preamble. "Lady Vivienne. I have spent the last 3 days tracing the rumor to its source, and I have found her." Elinor said nothing, uncertain what this confession was meant to resolve. "She fabricated it entirely," Alexander continued, his voice tight with a controlled fury Elinor had not yet witnessed in him. "There was no advance knowledge of my travel route on your part. I confirmed this with my own steward, who alone knew my intended path that night, and who has served this family for 30 years without ever once speaking a careless word to anyone, let alone to a woman my cousin has been cultivating for exactly this purpose. Vivienne invented the entire story from nothing but her own wounded ambition, hoping that if she could not secure me for herself, she might at least ensure I did not secure happiness with anyone else." "You believe me then?" Elinor said, carefully, unwilling to let herself hope too quickly. "I never stopped believing you," Alexander said, and the rawness in his voice undid the last of her careful composure. "The doubt you saw in my face in the library was never doubt of your honesty, Elinor. It was doubt of myself, of my own judgment, which failed me once already with Caroline, and which I feared, in some dark corner of my mind I am ashamed to admit existed, might be failing me again in ways I could not yet see. I did not doubt you. I doubted whether I had any right to trust my own heart at all, after it led me so badly astray once before." "That is its own kind of doubt," Elinor said, though gently now, the anger draining from her in the face of his evident anguish. "Even if it was never aimed at me directly." "You are entirely right," he said, "and I am sorrier for it than I know how to properly express. But I ask you to understand this, Elinor. In the 3 days it took me to trace Vivienne's lie to its source, I did not, for one single moment, consider abandoning the effort. I did not weigh whether proving your honesty was worth the trouble. I simply could not rest until it was done, because the thought of you leaving this house believing I doubted you was more unbearable to me than any doubt I have ever carried about myself." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, the evidence of sleepless nights spent in pursuit of the truth on her behalf. "I love you," he said, simply as though the words had been waiting behind every careful, formal sentence he had spoken to her since the moment she opened her cottage door to a soaked and shivering stranger. "Not the version of me that owns half of England, and not the version of you that my uncle's debts made convenient. I love the woman who gave a stranger tea and a fire without asking what he could offer her in return, and I have loved her, I think, since the very first moment she told me she had had a great deal of practice being calm about things she could not change." Elinor felt the letter of withdrawal, still folded in her pocket, grow suddenly and profoundly irrelevant. "I was going to leave," she admitted, quietly. "I had written to you already." Explaining, "I know," Alexander said. "Your maid mentioned it to my housekeeper, who mentioned it to me, in something of a panic, not an hour ago. It is, I confess, the reason I did not wait to change out of my riding clothes before finding you. Despite everything, despite the week of grief and doubt and the cruelty of Vivian's lie, Elinor found herself laughing. A small, surprised sound that broke something loose in her chest, some tension she had been carrying since the night of the storm, without fully realizing its weight. "I do not forgive Lady Vivian," she said, when the laughter had eased into something softer. "Nor do I," Alexander said. "She will not remain a welcome guest in this house, I assure you. But I hope very much, Elinor, that you might still consider forgiving me, for the silence I kept that first night, and for the doubt I let show, however briefly and however wrongly aimed, in the library." Elinor studied him for a long moment, the Earl who had once been simply Ash, who had traced a cruel lie to its source across 3 sleepless days rather than let it stand unanswered, who had surrendered his own advantage in a debt settlement simply to give her back a choice the world had tried twice over to take from her, and felt, at last, the final guarded corner of her heart open entirely. "I forgive you," she said, "on one condition." "Anything," he said, and meant it so plainly that she nearly laughed again at the earnestness of it. "That you never again let me believe you are merely a groom," she said, "when in fact you are a man who owns very nearly half of England." "I believe," Alexander said, the ghost of his old careful formality returning now with warmth, rather than distance behind it, "that I can promise you that much, at the very least." The remainder of Elinor's stay at Ashworth Hall unfolded, with none of the guarded formality that had marked its beginning. Lady Vivian departed within the week, her welcome firmly and permanently withdrawn, and though whispers of the earlier rumour lingered a while longer in certain drawing rooms, they found no fertile ground once it became clear that Lord Ashworth himself had personally and publicly vouched for Miss Hartley's honesty before half the county's assembled gentry at a dinner arranged, Elinor suspected. For precisely that purpose. "I understand," Alexander said to the assembled table that evening, raising his glass with a steadiness that carried to every corner of the room, "that certain parties have found it entertaining to question Miss Hartley's character in recent weeks. I will say only this. I have known calculation, and I have known honesty, and I assure you all I am no longer easily confused between the two. Miss Hartley possesses more genuine goodness in a single evening's conversation than I have encountered in 9 years of London seasons combined, and any further doubt on the matter may be addressed directly to me." The silence that followed was, Elinor thought, rather more satisfying than any applause could have been. And the warmth in Alexander's eyes, as he caught her gaze across the table, told her, plainly, that he had meant every word of it not merely as defence, but as declaration. There remained, in the weeks before the wedding, one further trial neither of them had anticipated, though in hindsight Elinor would come to see it as the final test the fates seemed determined to set before her happiness could be trusted as real. Her uncle, emboldened by the evident success of the match and the settlement it promised, arrived at Ashworth Hall, unannounced one grey morning, with a proposal of his own devising, that the wedding be moved forward by a full month, and that the marriage settlement be restructured to grant him direct oversight of a portion of Elinor's future dowry income, ostensibly to manage on her behalf, until she had, in his words, grown accustomed to the responsibilities of her new position. "You mean," Elinor said, when he laid the proposal before her in the drawing-room, his tone as smooth and reasonable as though he were discussing nothing more consequential than the weather, "that you wish to continue drawing upon my circumstances even after the debt you arranged this marriage to settle has been paid in full." "I wish only to see you properly guided," Reginald said, bristling. "You are young yet, Elinor, and inexperienced in matters of such consequence. It would ease my mind considerably to know some portion of your affairs remained under a steadier hand than your own." Elinor might once, in the exhausted grief of the months following her father's death, have simply acquiesced, worn down by the sheer persistence of her uncle's authority, too tired to fight a battle she had little power to win. But she was not that woman any longer, and the dignity Alexander had helped her rediscover, rather than granted her, rose now with a clarity that surprised even her uncle. "You mistake me, uncle, if you believe marriage to an earl has made me more pliable rather than less," she said. "I thank you for your guardianship these past months, difficult as it has often been for us both, but I am to be a countess within the fortnight, mistress of a household larger than any you have ever managed, and I find I have grown rather practiced, of late, at recognizing when someone wishes to profit from an arrangement at my expense, while dressing the wish in the language of concern." Reginald's face reddened, but before he could formulate a response, Alexander entered the room, having caught the latter half of the exchange from the corridor, and the temperature of the conversation shifted at once. "Mr. Hartley," he said, with the particular coolness Elinor had witnessed only once before, in his confrontation with Lady Vivian, "I believe my future wife has answered you with more patience than the request perhaps deserved. Allow me to add only this. The settlement negotiated on your niece's behalf was structured, at my explicit instruction, to remain entirely within her own control, precisely because I anticipated that some party might one day attempt exactly what you now propose. I would consider it a personal insult, sir, were you to raise the matter again." Reginald departed within the hour, his ambitions for further profit from his niece's fortune thoroughly and permanently extinguished, and though the encounter left Elinor shaken, it left her also with a settled certainty she had not expected to feel so completely, that whatever fears had once haunted her about being merely useful to those around her, merely an asset to be managed rather than a woman to be valued, had no place left to take root in the life now opening before her. "I am sorry," Alexander said, once her uncle's carriage had rattled away down the long avenue of oaks, "that you should have to endure such a scene so close to our wedding." "Do not be," Elinor said, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she meant it entirely. "I have spent the better part of a year being spoken of and around, as though my own voice carried no particular weight in decisions that touched my life most directly. It was, I think, rather necessary that I learn to speak for myself in a moment that mattered. Before I stood before you, and promised to be your equal in all the years to come. I should not like to have arrived at our marriage still uncertain whether I could stand my own ground when it counted. You have never, in the whole of our acquaintance, struck me as anything less than entirely capable of standing your own ground," Alexander said, taking her hand. "I merely wished you did not have to prove it quite so often, nor against those who ought by rights to have protected you from the necessity." "Perhaps," Elinor said, "that is simply the shape my particular dignity was forced to take, given the year I have had. I do not resent it any longer. I think, in some strange way, it has made me rather better suited to the life I am about to begin than I might otherwise have been." It was, in the days that followed, this very quality in her, the hard-won steadiness beneath her warmth, the dignity that had survived every diminishment the world attempted to press upon her, that Alexander found himself admiring more with each passing hour, and which the assembled tenants and staff of Ashworth Hall, watching their future countess move among them with unaffected kindness in the final weeks before the wedding, came quietly and quickly to love in their turn. The wedding, when it came at last in early autumn, bore none of the cold formality Elinor had once dreaded on that first night. The letter arrived bearing an unfamiliar seal. The chapel where Alexander had once confessed the wound of his broken engagement was filled instead with a warmth that seemed, to Elinor, to have been waiting patiently for years to be given proper occasion. Her uncle, whatever his original motives, wept with what appeared to be genuine sentiment as he walked her down the aisle. Though Elinor suspected the settling of his debts contributed no small measure to his emotion. Her Aunt Constance dabbed at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony, declaring afterward that she had never in her life witnessed a match so evidently, unmistakably founded on genuine affection rather than mere advantage. And Alexander, waiting at the altar in a manner far removed from the cold, distant lord the village had once whispered of, watched Elinor walk toward him with an expression so unguarded, so entirely undefended, that she felt the last remnant of every old fear, of being unwanted, of being merely convenient, of being assigned rather than chosen, dissolve completely into the certainty of a love that had, after all, begun not with titles or fortunes, but with a soaked stranger seeking shelter from a storm, and a woman who had opened her door without asking what she might gain by it. "I once told you," Alexander murmured, as the ceremony drew to its close and the assembled guests rose in celebration around them, "that I did not think I would easily forget you, Miss Hartley." "And I once told you," Elinor answered, "that I should like, above all things, to be chosen rather than assigned." "Then let it be said," Alexander replied, taking her hand in his before the whole of the assembled county, "that I choose you, Elinor Vane, Countess of Ashworth, not for the debt you settle, nor the advantage you bring, but simply and entirely for the woman who gave a stranger tea and kindness on the worst night of a storm, and asked for nothing at all in return." Outside, the last of autumn's light fell golden across the grounds of Ashworth Hall, touching the orangery where his mother's roses still bloomed, the library where a third of a lifetime's books still waited to be read together, the chapel where two wounded hearts had finally fully healed each other, and somewhere among the vast lands that stretched, in every direction, further than the eye could see, a signet ring rested once more upon the hand that had first offered it in gratitude. No longer a token of a debt owed, but a promise, finally and completely kept.